Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I see some faces dialing in from the other side of the world. Welcome to today's presentation, Gardening with More Joy and Less Work. Most of you here today know Joseph for his book, Landrace Gardening, and his teachings about adaptation agriculture. Like me, you've probably grown and enjoyed some of the resilient and tasty crops that he's stewarded. Things like the beautiful Harmony grain corn, his delicious muskmelons, or my personal favorite, the Lofthouse buttercup. Joseph has adapted over 100 crops to his harsh mountain climate in Paradise, Utah. You may have also caught a glimpse of Joseph's spiritual side, his devotion to the practice of yoga, his love of the earth, of singing and dancing, and of living barefoot. Today, we're going to hear a personal story from Joseph. He's going to share with us the story of how he became who he is today, which is the story of darkness and redemption, and of learning to adapt rather than control. As he goes through his talk, please feel free to pop questions into the chat function as they come up. We will have plenty of time at the end of the lecture for questions, and we'll be pulling those from the chat. So do put them in there if you want to ask a question. I'm so grateful to Joseph for sharing this story with us today. Please welcome my dear friend and mentor, Joseph Lofthouse.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for everyone that is participating today. It means a lot to me. So I'd like to thank Anna, Julia, Holly, and Dr. Christie for helping me with preparations for my presentations and for making these beautiful slides. And also would like to thank Chef Dan Barber, because he always asks me the question, who are you and what do you believe? And then he says, really? And it's like, really helps me to get to the heart of who I am and understand myself better. And also like to thank Bill McDormand of Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance and Jer Gettle of Baker Creek Seeds for giving me so many opportunities to speak and to learn how to be a more public instead of being a little quiet farmer out in the boonies. So I grew up on a horse on a family farm, and my family has been there for 160 years now. When I was a kid, we lived right on the edge of the wilderness, and the wild animals would come onto our farm and they'd eat the animals, and family was feared that they'd eat the kids as well. And so this mountain lion came off of my farm when I was a kid. And about that same time, like when I was 5 years old or so, I got my first garden that was just my own garden. And I sent 1 penny into Gurney's, and they sent me back a packet of jumbled up seed. And I remember it had a nasturtium seed in it, and it was so lovely and big. And I think I only grew nasturtiums 2 times in my life, but I really just love that immensely. And so when I prepare what I call a Fukuoka grab bag these days, it takes me back to that sweeps the floor kind of seed mix that Gurney sold me as a child. I grew up in a Mormon family. Everyone in my community was Mormon and had been for as long as the community had existed. And so I remember from my childhood, when I was about as big as in this picture with the lion, I would drive the truck for my daddy while he would pick up hay bales and throw them onto the truck. And I could barely see over the dashboard, and I somehow missed steering and I went up over a bale of hay. Whoa! Crashed down on the other side. Then the second wheel went over and oh! And that's one of the most memorable experiences from my life. I don't remember anything about the hay or if Daddy was okay, but I just remember that terrible crashing sound. And when I was growing up, I was a bookworm. I read every book I could get my hands on about science, and I read all the science fiction, and I read mysteries and just whatever my library had that was of interest to me. During this time, I milked the family cow, and that was my first exposure to what I think of as Zen, or being able to find calmness in a person's life, because cows are smart and they don't want some upset little kid getting anywhere near them to milk them. And so that helped me early on in my life to learn just to kind of set aside some of that upsetness so that I could please the cow. Every cow that we ever had was called Sugi, and I didn't know why until after I was an adult. But when I was a little tiny baby, just barely a toddler, my daddy was taking me to milk with him, and he would say to the cow, it's okay," to try to calm the cow down. And of course, I thought that was the cow's name. So every cow we ever had after that was called Sugi. And I have been farming my whole life. This photo's, I was maybe 14, 15, somewhere in that ballpark. A Big Mac's pumpkin, again from Gurney's, and I think it weighed 106.5 pounds. And we grew by conventional farming. So if there was a bug, we smashed it, we poisoned it, we trapped it. If there was, we put or, uh, fertilizers on, chemical fertilizers, because we were going to dominate and control the ecosystem and the garden and everything about it. And that was just normal to me because everybody did that. So who would know that there was any other way of living? And I grew up the oldest of 13 brothers and sisters. There were three more that died as children. And so we grew a huge garden. It was about an acre. And we hunted, we fished, we preserved, we froze. I remember one summer, well, we had the family garden, and then I had my own separate garden, which I grew sweet corn in, and I grew cucumbers, which I picked when they were about thumb size, so that my neighbors could do pickling. And I saved up $127 one summer and bought myself a bicycle. And woohoo, it was a fancy 3-speed bicycle too. So because I had such high test scores in school, because I was constantly reading, I attracted the attention of a professor up at the university. And so when I was a junior in high school, I started working in the chemistry lab up at the university. And I continued working in the lab doing research until I graduated from college, and so that mostly paid for my college education, along with I worked in an apple orchard. I would prune trees, make apple cider, that kind of things. And one of the first projects we worked on was, like, this was when I was still in high school, was we were substituting a boron atom for a carbon atom inside the Roundup molecule, and hoping that that would have some kind of different properties than what the Roundup had. And that was so interesting work because the chemicals I was working with were like explosive, and if they ever got in contact with air or water, they would burn and explode. And they had lithium compounds that were just this bright, brilliant red, and there was boron compounds which were these green, just as green as could be. And so that was an exciting kind of work for a kid in high school to be doing. And so I was just continuing to live my life as a good little Mormon boy. I got married to a sweetie and had a child. I continued to grow vegetables after I got married and went to the farmer's market. We moved to Ohio and where I spent most of my chemistry degree. And so one of the things that I developed in my career, this was like 30 years ago, is we got all these plant materials in from all around the world and we were testing them. I would take the chemicals out of them and then spray them on ticks to see if the ticks would die because of what was in the chemical or what was in the plant. And so we discovered the neem plant and commercialized that for a Japanese company. And so when people are treating their dogs with neem oil, that came out of research that I did. And there was other, as I was working on this, I began to find out that those chemicals were unsafe, they were dangerous. We were telling lies to the public about their safety, and we were picking and choosing which studies we were going to emphasize. And I got really kind of annoyed at the at scientists for being duplicitous and for letting this kind of stuff go on. And and if the public distrusts science, there's a good reason for it because of those kinds of shenanigans. And then I switched departments at work and I went to work for a part of the company that was involved in research into weapons of mass destruction. So chemicals to harm people, biological agents to harm people. And that was all secret, secret, hush, hush. So I couldn't talk about it with my family. I couldn't talk about it with my wife or my bishop. And so I'm just getting more and more upset about the work I was involved in, and 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 then people were using my work to justify going to wars like with Iraq. And like one example I remember is the news reported that airplanes were dropping chemical weapons on military bases, and and they collected samples of that and brought it to my laboratory. Well, when we actually analyzed it, this chemical structure was identical to spider webs, because spiders, they have their webs and they float through the air when they're little tiny babies, and so they can spread to new areas. But that kind of thing was used for justification for murdering millions of people, and I was feeling that in my body and holding on to all of those emotions that I couldn't release and I couldn't share with anybody. And my weight just skyrocketed. And to try to counteract that, I started a food pantry and I asked the local fire department if I could grow a garden on the land that they had there. And so I was growing a huge garden for my community and distributing food for the food pantry. And and then at night I would have these dreams where I'd go and try to rescue the people that were being harmed by my work during the day. And it's reported in the newspaper that the anthrax that was released through the US mail came out of my laboratory. And I believe that the motivation for that was it came out shortly after my company received the contract to make the anthrax vaccine. And then my company made $1 billion off of selling that anthrax vaccine to the military. And when the FBI was investigating that, it it came out that the CIA was involved in that shenanigan, and so the whole investigation basically just stopped. And eventually they blamed the the anthrax on a scientist that committed suicide, or they say he committed suicide. And so there was no, the it just ended without any resolution about what really happened. But I was right there in the middle of that, separated by a pane of glass from the actual anthrax, and so it just tore me apart, and I ended up having a nervous breakdown, and I ended up in a monastery to recover that's in Provo, Utah. And in the process, I lost all of my hopes and dreams. I lost my beautiful family. I lost my, imagined future of bliss in a house with a white picket fence. I lost my church. I lost any faith in my country. So I was there for about 3 years, and one of my duties, or a couple of my duties while I was there, is I continued to run a food pantry, and I was principal of the high school there. And while I was there, I took a vow of poverty, and I took a vow that I was never again going to use those poisons to poison people, to poison the ecosystem, to poison Mother Nature. And and during that time, I was pretty bitter and angry and upset, and one day I had to just make a choice. I said either I can live with this constant turmoil or I can just stop and just let it go. And so that's the path that I chose, and I'm happy for it. So I returned to my farm, and for the last 14 years, I haven't used any chemicals, any fertilizers, or any pesticides on my farm. No herbicides, nothing to harm my garden. And yes, I still remember how easy it was to use Roundup, and it's just not something that's in my toolbox. So these days I don't even think about that. So I became a market farmer. This is my Aunt Sharon at the farmer's market in Paradise, Utah. 4 for $1 for those big, huge tomatoes. It's been a long time ago. Anyway, so I grow in a high elevation mountain valley. The field there is around 5,000 feet. The mountains right next to it are around 9,000 feet. So all summer, all winter, the cold comes down out of those mountains right into my field. And so I would try planting the heirlooms, and the heirlooms are varieties from far away and long ago. They don't know how to deal with my ecosystem. And then I tried planting the hybrids, but the hybrids have been developed in a system that requires the poisons and it requires the chemical fertilizers, so they didn't do good for me. I tried growing open pollinated varieties. They didn't do good for me because they've been inbred for so long that they've lost vigor. And so I was really, really struggling. And if I bought seeds from the seed catalogs, those seeds come from China, Vietnam, Oregon, Iowa, places that are totally different ecosystem than my garden, and so they just didn't thrive for me. So I was looking for something to bring a little bit of joy and happiness to my customers. And I found a sweet corn that had many colors. Woo! It had reds and oranges and blues and just a beautiful sweet corn. And so I ordered some seed from Alan Bishop in Pekin, Indiana. And I planted it on the same day that I planted my regular sweet corn, my F1 hybrid from the commercial seed catalog. But I had purchased it without its protective chemicals because you know corn comes with these red chemicals around it to protect it. And Allen's corn germinated at 100%, and the commercial sweet corn germinated at like 5%. And Allen's corn grew robustly, and then I opened it up and tasted it, and oh my heck, every color on that on those kernels have a different flavor, and it was just a joy to eat. And because of that, I decided that I was going to convert every variety that I grow into this kind of crop. And what he sent me is called a landrace. And a landrace is a crop that is genetically diverse, promiscuously pollinating, so it can adapt itself to local conditions. And that leads to super reliability and consistency. You can count on a crop. And so I started converting like 100 species to this kind of growing. And the thing I noticed right off the bat is that the ecosystem does 80% of the selection. This is, for example, okra, and they're growing like 2 feet from each other. And one thought, oh, I feel cold today, so I'm just going to die. And the other says, oh, cold, I don't know what that is. And so the ecosystem is really good at deciding what can grow in any particular place. Another example of the ecosystem doing the selection is one day I went out to my field and skunks and raccoons had come in and they had eaten like 95% of my sweet corn. Just gobbled it up, you know, from one visit to the next. And and so my old way of doing things was, okay, I got to go shoot the raccoons, I got to poison them, I got to trap them, I got to put scary music on in the garden to frighten them away. You know, all these ways that I could control and dominate the animal population. Well, then I decided, okay, I need to live in harmony with my principles. And so I saved the seeds from like the 5% of the crop that was left and and replanted those seeds the next year. The skunks and raccoons came along again and they gobbled up the crop, but this time they only gobbled up, or they left like, I don't know, half of it. And so then the third year I replanted those seeds, and the third year the skunks and raccoons didn't bother the corn at all. And what had happened, I think, is that skunks and raccoons are lazy. They just want to come to the garden and push a corn stalk over and eat the cob because they don't want to have to climb up the cob and or climb up the stalk and try to figure out how to open the cob when it's up in the air and fall off and and so the corn had developed these big strong stalks that made it hard for the animals to push it over, and the cobs on the corn had went from like knee high up to chest high, and so they really had to work at it. And the other thing that that did, totally inadvertently, is that it made it easier for me to harvest. So instead of stooping over to harvest the corn, I could just walk through the patch and harvest it at waist high, chest high. And it was just a beautiful example of allowing the ecosystem to do the selection instead of me trying to control and dominate which traits I think the plants should have. So, because of my history as a chemist, when I originally started saving my own seeds, I was keeping meticulous records, and I was keeping these super complicated pedigrees, and I was saving like thousands of packets of seeds a year, each mother plant in its own packet. And I was just, just keeping records because that's what you do when you're a chemist. And one day I realized while I was in the garden planting that I had spent more time keeping records than I had actually doing any farming. And the record keeping stopped that day. Um, so then I had a choice to make. Either I could grow twice as much food with the same labor, or I could do half the labor and have time left over for other things. And so, being me, I chose other things. I chose to learn to play the guitar. I learned to sing. I learned to I learned yoga. I learned to run, to dance, to sew. I learned to love hot springs. And so, because I gave up the record keeping, it gave me a lot of opportunity to have more joy in the garden. And another thing that has brought me a lot of joy is my interactions with my community. When I wrote my book, well, like 14 years ago, I started using the term landrace gardening. And when I published my book, that was kind of troubling for people because it had political connotations, and I had to define landrace because that's like a little technical word from the botany journals, and nobody knew what that meant intuitively. And so my community and I got together and we chatted and we discussed and we worked together peacefully to come up with new language to describe my work. And what we came up with was adaptation agriculture for bigger farmers and adaptation gardening for smaller scale people. And that sense of community and camaraderie and cooperation pretty much flows through all of my work, and I'm so grateful for it and for the people that helped me to learn how to drop my ego. And because biology is fuzzy, and coming from a scientist background and from a Mormon background where you have right and wrong, good and bad, biology is more mushy and squishy, and so I'm really grateful for my community for helping me get into that squishy part of my life. One of the beautiful benefits of adaptation agriculture is that because it's community oriented, we can share seeds with each other. And I'd like to tell you a story about my collaboration with a lady that lives here in my valley named Susan Oliverson. And Susan and I decided that we wanted to grow cantaloupes because cantaloupes don't grow in my valley. But why is that going to stop me? And so we collected together like 30 varieties of cantaloupes that we got from the grocery store. We got them from the farmer's market down in Salt Lake. We got them from seed catalogs, just anywhere that we could find cantaloupes. And we planted them, and the first year, some of them didn't germinate. Some of them got an inch tall and got eaten by bugs. Some of them in the whole growing season were like little 6-inch plants. And a few did okay and produced some fruits, but the fruits were still green by the time they got killed by frost. So then the second year, we replanted those seeds. I mean, we planted the seeds we harvested the previous year. And again, some of them barely grew at all, and some of them grew into robust, vigorous plants. The one plant there were two plants in the field that year that produced more cantaloupes than the entire rest of the patch combined, like more than 100 other plants. And so that second year, then the best of the best can cross with each other. And so by the third year, I was harvesting bushels and bushels and bushels of cantaloupe, and they were ready many weeks before our frost. Another thing that happened to the cantaloupes is I was tasting them before I saved seeds from them and smelling them. And I remember one time, or you could walk into my field and you could just smell the honey, the cantaloupes just wafting over the whole field. And one time I picked them and put them in my truck, on the inside of the truck, and fumigated myself just because there was so much odor coming from them, and they were so flavorful and melt in your mouth soft and just sweet as could be. And so I had to give them a different name because I would take them to farmers market and people would say, I don't like cantaloupe. And that is because they were comparing my cantaloupes to what they get in the grocery store that has that same name. And so I started calling what I grow muskmelons, because then you set the stage for people that they're going to be joyful and happy and tasty and smelly. And I love making wine and muskmelon vinegar. It really is a lovely thing to do with muskmelons. And if you're a market farmer and you're selling a melon at the farmer's market, you might get $4 out of it, but it's got $60 worth of seeds inside of it. So if you do the math on that, it doesn't take very much to realize that maybe instead of growing fruits, farmers should be growing seeds. And also backyard gardeners should be growing seeds, because that many seeds could last you for a decade and really save you a lot of money in the over or in the coming years. And you get seed that is fresher, more reliable, it's locally adapted. One thing that I think I have been selecting for is not necessarily resistance to my ecosystem only, but I've been selecting inadvertently for a general resistance to stress. So when my stuff goes to a warmer climate or a colder climate, like this picture is from Julia Dakin's garden in Mendocino, California, that the plants have enough genetic diversity and enough ability to adapt with stress that they can really thrive. I did a seed share with Mark Reed from southern Indiana, and he's growing sweet potatoes. And so him and I were swapping sweet potato seeds, and it's just a joy to see how they could adapt to different locations like that. So when we start adaptation agriculture, promiscuous pollination is the name of the game. And we love our pollinators. And all of a sudden, because we value promiscuous pollination, we can get rid of all of the stress that people wanted to put on us about how to save seeds. All of a sudden, the isolation distances don't matter, the purity doesn't matter, the number of parents doesn't matter. If you look at, if you think to that sweet corn that I showed earlier on, there is more diversity in one cob of that sweet corn than there is in thousands of acres of the sweet corn that the commercial farmers are growing here in my valley. And So when you embrace diversity, all sorts of problems with seed saving just disappear. And it turns out that customers love diversity. The Utah State University conducted a study about why people buy my vegetables at the farmer's market. And I thought they were going to say, oh, because they're organic, because they're local, because I'm saving fuel, because, all these things. And it startled me that people said that the reason they buy my vegetables is because of the flavor. How would I have known that? Because this is just what I eat. And it turned out that people would buy anything I put on the table at the farmer's market because of the reputation I had for only putting the most excellent tasting food on the table. And the reason that that happened is because I taste every fruit before I save seeds from it. And so over the years, I'm selecting for this just the most beautiful, delightful, joyful, happy flavors. And people really appreciate that when they buy my varieties. So flavor is one of those things that just sings to my heart. And and I love sharing beautiful flavors with people. I remember I invited a guy over for lunch one time, and after lunch he says, "You programmed this food to heal me, didn't you?" And I'm like, "What the heck?" But I had to agree with him that yes, I did, because I had spent the last 10 years selecting for beautiful flavors, beautiful aromas, and for plants that just thrive in my ecosystem. And if they're thriving in my ecosystem, then they're naturally going to taste better. They're going to be more healing. And if I want to get woo-woo, I think that if you grow something with love, that it responds accordingly. And I often wonder about the microbes in my skin and my DNA, and I'm sharing that with the seeds. And I often wonder if that interaction is blessing me and the seeds in a way that can't happen with mechanical harvesting where the seed only touches metal. And so that's our woo-woo for the day. So then I started my yoga teacher training, and life is good. This is a hot spring up in, I'll call it northern Idaho, and people love to make their little towers of rocks up at the hot springs in Idaho. So then I wrote my book because my yoga teacher training got interrupted by a COVID pandemic, and the government said that it was illegal for me to go to yoga anymore. And so then I'm upset. And the corporations are sending out these unproven, dangerous vaccines. And it was the same scenario as I went through with the chemical weapons and the anthrax. And I was just tore up again. And so I wrote in my book angry, nasty stuff about the chemical companies, about the seed companies, and it was not pretty. But then I'm like, okay, been there, done that already once in my life, and so just stop. And so I went through and deleted pages and pages from my book and put this meme into my book. I am not trying to change anyone, but pursuing what I love. And I think I put it different in my book. What did it say? oh, victory comes not from quarreling with evil, but from pursuing what we love, or something like that. And that has really been my saying to myself as I've went through this journey of adaptation agriculture, is because one of the things that my yoga training taught me is it taught me about what's called non-dualistic tantra. Basically, the idea that I am not separate from nature, nature's not separate from me, we're not separate from each other, we're all part of one great whole. Like the microbes that are in me, there's more microbe cells in me than there are human cells. And so I end up thinking of myself as an ecosystem instead of thinking of myself as a discrete thing in a box. And so I deleted most of the bitching out of my book. There's still a little bit if you know where to look. Chapter 2, I think. Anyway, so that was just joyful to me to finally, hopefully, put that anger and anxiety behind me more successfully than I ever have in the past. So earlier I talked about the ecosystem doing 80% of the selection, and I found that with squash. For example, this big huge squash leaf spreads out and it shades the garden, and so the weeds don't grow up with the squash. And what a beautiful trait to have, because all of a sudden the I don't have to weed my squash patch. And so I've saved even more time and more opportunities for joy in the garden. And the shading that these plants do can last for years because they shade out like the morning glory, which is one of the worst weeds around here. And then it doesn't get going the next year because it died during the summer. And I noticed the same sort of thing with carrots. I was having a really hard time growing carrots for the farmer's market because the carrots would take like 2 or 3 weeks to germinate, and they'd be these little tiny plants when they did come up, and the weeds were already rambunctious, and I would just lose them in the weeds. And so I says, okay, I will apply the principles of adaptation gardening. So I grew a patch of carrots 1 year with no weeding. And I got a few carrots out of that, which were like the diameter of a pencil, like, a pencil, and about 3 inches long. But I planted those the next year, grew seeds from them, replanted the seeds, and did that a second year. Well, the second year I got a few carrots were like the size of my thumb. So we're moving in the right direction. And then the third year, this photo is from the third year, and you see that there's one plant there circled in a yellow circle, which is like the old carrots used to be, little wimpy things that wouldn't grow. And then there's a big robust carrots right next to them that had figured out how to grow and compete with my weeds. And so the third year I weeded the carrots, and I chopped out all of those little rinky-dink carrots too. And at the end of the growing season, I was harvesting carrots that were 3 pounds, 5 pounds, just these big, happy, joyful carrots that could feed me a meal for a week. Just more joy by allowing the plants to figure out for themselves how to solve problems that I had previously been trying to solve with poisons or chemicals or fertilizers or labor or techniques. So another thing I hear from people oftentimes is you shouldn't save seeds because 50 years ago somebody died by eating a poison squash. or or fear that monsters are going to all of a sudden appear in my garden. And what I have observed is that if you cross two great varieties together, the offspring from those varieties tend to have traits that are halfway in between the traits of the parent varieties. So you cross a Hubbard with a banana, you get a squash that looks kind of like a Hubbard with a banana kind of like skin. And that hybrid is one of the tastiest squash that I've ever eaten. It's just a beautiful, happy squash. Um, for 10,000 years, illiterate plant breeders who understood nothing about botany or science or DNA have been developing beautiful varieties. And they brought me every variety that I currently grow. And so thank you to people that have saved seeds just because they can, and paying attention that you tend to get what you select for. And what I love to select for is flavor. I select for productivity. It's got to produce seeds for me, and I select for flavor. Selecting for flavor is really joyful if you do it in a community setting. This is down at Julia's place in Mendocino again, and I'm remembering Sky put some flowers on my room that day, or that day before, and Sky was there, I think, with the tasting, and just having a joyful time with new friends. So when we start saving and sharing seeds as local communities, it gives us a lot of sovereignty. It gives us a lot of security in our food system. We don't have to worry that the seed companies are going to not be able to sell us seeds because the government shuts down seed sales. We don't have to worry about the seed companies not carrying our favorite variety because we already grew the seeds ourselves. If I do something dumb and I lose my seeds, like one day I dropped like 5 bottles of seeds onto the sidewalk and they all shattered and went all haywire, and but I had community that could, help me to recover from that. And I welcome people's reject seeds. Like if they're growing beans and they get one bean that's the wrong color that shows up in their patch, I embrace that and welcome it into my garden because it might be a hybrid, and hybrids tend to grow well for me, better than the inbred bean seeds. And I remember I went to a conference one time with Lisa Bludnick in, let's see, Northeast Organic Farmers Association in New York. And she had 2 tables, and spread out on those 2 tables was 1,000 varieties of beans, each in its little container, and they were just a joy to behold. And then she teased me and said Joseph also brought 1,000 varieties of beans, all in one jar. And that pretty much summarizes my attitude towards diversity. Bring it all together, let things cross-pollinate, and they'll figure out for themselves how to really grow and really be pleasing to me. So when I decided that I was going to stop trying to control and dominate the ecosystem, that gave a lot of opportunity for beauty to show up in my yard, in my life. I don't think anymore about invasive species. All species are welcome to me. Wherever they used to grow, they're growing here now. And no matter how much poison I put on them, they're not going to stop growing here. And so I welcome all life into my garden, whether it's insect life or viruses or whatever, plants. They're just welcome in my, whoops, look at this. I got a slide for that. Thank you. Thank you, beautiful slide magicians. So I welcome bugs, pests, viruses, and molds into my garden because they are teaching my plants how to survive. They're selecting for plants that thrive in the ecosystem exactly as it exists. So I don't have to put all that labor, worry, because the ecosystem can select what wants to grow in my garden. And so this plant has all kinds of insects on it, just devouring the plant. And one thing that I think happens to plants is that in the history of life on Earth, nitrogen has been like a limiting resource for plants. And so they haven't developed mechanisms to say no to the nitrogen. And so the roots just take up whatever nitrogen they can get, and then if there's too much nitrogen in the soil, it poisons the plants, and it creates sap that's full of proteins and amino acids, and the plant cries out to the ecosystem, "Oh, please help me, I've got too much amino acids." Well, the insects love amino acids because it's what they build their protein out of. And so the insects will come along and gladly consume the plants to help bring balance back into the into the plant and help it get rid of the excess nitrogen. So if you're over fertilizing your garden, perhaps that's a good explanation of why bugs like eating your crops so much. Ha ha ha. So people ask me about squash bugs in my garden, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know that I have any pest problems or any disease problems in my garden. But one year, my friend Julie asked if she could grow squash in my garden, and I'm like, sure, go ahead. You can have, that little corner over there. So she planted squash in my garden, and the squash bugs just pounced on it. Like, really? And then the diseases came and pounced on the squash, and her squash were shriveled up, and the bugs totally devoured them. And I know that it's not polite to like snicker at other people's misfortune, but I was so happy for that because it showed me that yes, I do have those bugs, I do have those diseases in my garden, but they're not bothering the plants because the squash and the bugs and the diseases had figured out how to live in harmony with each other. And so it was just a joyful confirmation to me about how adaptation gardening can really work well for us. I want to tell a story about the Colorado potato beetles. So my job the whole time I was growing up was to go out into the potato patch and crush the eggs of the Colorado potato beetles, crush the beetles. My daddy's job was to poison the beetles, and so between us we just were constantly fighting the Colorado potato beetles. And because or one day I was in my garden and I noticed that I had a wild weed growing, and that is called green night solanum physalifolium is an old name that's got a different name now, but and so it was like the original host plant for the Colorado potato beetle. And so I made a contract with the beetles, and it goes something like this. I will never poison you, or I'll never crush you as long as you eat only the green nightshade. But if you get on a potato, or if you get on a potato, I'll crush you, I'll crush your offspring. If you get on a tomato, I'll crush you, I'll crush your offspring. And then if a potato or a tomato attracts beetles more than once, then I'm going to yank the potato out as well, or the tomato, so that there's no chance at all of confusing the terms of the contract. And so basically what I did is I trained my Colorado potato beetles to eat my weed. And and so I was doing plant breed or bug breeding basically on the Colorado potato beetles. And that's a really nice place to be when the bugs eat your weeds for you. And that works with the Colorado potato beetles because they're a ground resident in my garden. That kind of contract doesn't work so well with the cabbage moths because they just blow in on the wind every summer. So I have had a lot of fun over the years working on the Profoundly Promiscuous and Totally Tasty Tomatoes project. And what I've been selecting for in that project is for tomatoes with great big huge flowers that are attractive to pollinators so that they can be cross-pollinating and the tomatoes can figure out for themselves how to solve the problems that I've previously been trying to solve with techniques or labor or materials or, when I was a kid, pesticides, poisons, that kind of stuff. And it turns out that Chef Dan Barber sent my tomatoes to Dr. White at Rutgers University, and they found out that nitrogen-fixing microbes are living in the roots of my tomatoes. That's that photo on the bottom with all of that blue in that is where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are living. And so my tomatoes have figured out a way to live in harmony with nitrogen-fixing bacteria to get what they need out of the ecosystem. And if I had been fertilizing my garden with chemical fertilizers all these years, we might have never realized that tomatoes have the ability to enter into relationships with the bacteria that they need to get what they need out of the ecosystem. And the tomatoes are taking those microbes and they're storing those microbes inside the seeds, and so that the microbes just make the journey with the seeds. And so it comes back to again, you can't really separate the microbes from the plants, and they're all sort of all this jumbled together, kind of the same thing. A lot of people grow tomatoes and they treat them like they're babies. They give them trellises, they give them poisons to kill the bugs and poisons to kill the fungus and fertilizers. And what they end up doing is they end up selecting for tomatoes that have to be pruned, that have to be trellised, that have to have fertilizer. And when I grow tomatoes, I grow them sprawling in a weed patch. They lay in the dirt and the irrigation system throws dirt on the leaves. And the weeds grow up through them because I want to select for tomatoes that are strong and vibrant, can outcompete the weeds, that don't have to have fertilizers, that don't have to be sprayed, that don't have blossom end rot. If I'm going through my tomato patch and I see one fruit with blossom end rot, it is gone so fast. There's no place for that in my garden because I call it a genetic issue with the tomato. It's not my fault because I'm a bad farmer and I don't know how to water and I don't know how to add calcium to my garden. I'm like, let the tomatoes be tomatoes, let them grow, prosper, and not these little delicate things that we have to coddle all the time. So I'd like to end with a blessing. May your garden thrive and bring you joy. So I would like to chant for you. May all beings everywhere all be happy and free. In Sanskrit, those words are loka samasta sukino bhavantu. May all beings everywhere all be happy and free. May all beings everywhere all be happy and free. May all beings everywhere all be happy and free. Loka samasta sukino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukino bhavantu. May all beings everywhere all be happy and free. Oh, I have two more slides. Let me see if I can get those running. So my book is Landrace Gardening, Food Security Through Biodiversity and Promiscuous Pollination, which could just as easily be called How to Grow Food When You Can't Buy Seeds or Fertilizers. It is available from goingtoseed.org. And I invite you to join me at goingtoseed.org, where our intention is to shift agriculture towards adaptation, community, and diversity. We offer video courses about my book, about microbes, about ancient farming techniques in Mexico. We offer community forums. We offer seed shares, both formal and informal. We offer a farmer support program, and just have a lot, we have a lot of joy collaborating with each other and helping to grow more reliable food for our local communities.
Yeah.
Joseph, thank you. That was beautiful. Everyone, we want you to ask questions, put those into your chat box. Joseph, you and I have a similar story of dropping a large amount of weight. Most people don't talk about it, and if they're curious, they're too kind to ask. But I would like to ask you a little bit about your experience. As you went through the presentation, you talked about the stress that you went through and how hard that was on you emotionally and physically, and you had gained so much weight. So would you talk to us a little bit about what it took for your mind to get to the spot where you could lose the weight and how that has helped you with your gardening and reaching your life goals?
Well, I love eating because I'm stressed. And if I'm stressed, the best kind of food to eat is sugar and bread. And so way back when I was in the laboratory, I knew that sugar was really dangerous for me, but I continued to eat a lot of wheat after that. And it wasn't until I got really serious about cutting way back on the wheat that I ate that the weight started dropping off. And that was about the same time that I took my first yoga class, and it was a yoga for exercise only, but I was so heavy that I couldn't put my shoes on, and I was so inflexible that it was starting to get in the way of actually living my life. I remember the first time they asked me to fold forward in yoga class, I got like I touched my knees just barely. And, but then I started moving more in my garden. And like I I would squat down and stuff, and so I started using my muscles a little more. That's about the time I started to run because I'd freed up my time in the garden by not keeping records, and so I was becoming more mobile. And also just because I dropped the stress. I'm like, because the stress eating is really a bad habit that I've carried most of my life. And if I can stay away from that, I tend to do pretty good on the weight.
So do you
But
want to
I
tell
know
how much weight you lost?
70 pounds.
That's awesome.
How much did you lose, Holly?
90.
Wow, good for you.
Okay, so Ray, you have a question.
Yeah, just a practical question. When you're starting with a crop in the first year and you only manage to get seeds from one or two plants, like your story, that creates a bottleneck, I would have thought. And I'm just wondering what's the best way to go about sorting that out in the future.
Oh, so I have two different mechanisms that I use. And the first is that I might gather together like 20, 30, 200 varieties and plant them and just see which survive. And the other way that I might go about it is I plant my favorite variety and then I plant another variety nearby. And and if I like the new variety, then I'll save seeds for both of them together and they might cross-pollinate. So you can either do it all at once or you can do it gradual.
And Debbie has a question. What is your vision for an ideal future?
Oh, thank you, Debbie. So what I would really love to see in my garden is that my ecosystem became my garden. So I would just go outside and I would harvest fruits and vegetables that grew themselves without me planting them, weeding them, fertilizing them, or nothing. And I remember, like, well, I don't remember, but my daddy tells the story that 70 years ago, 80 years ago, whatever it is, he was out in the wilderness having a food fight with his cousin, and they were throwing apricots at each other. And today there's a grove of apricots that are growing out in the wilderness. And if if my gardening could be like that, then that would make me really happy and content.
So I would love to hear more about how you were able to let go of your anger, right? You went through such a dark period in your life and understandably had a lot of anger. How did you let go of that and how do you stay positive in today's
So,
world?
thank you, Anna. I remember the day that it happened, actually, because I was like just furious, 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 and it was eating me up, and just, the excitement in my body, and I'm like, no, just stop. That's not who I am. Choose a different path. And and that was basically what it took to turn the corner, is just making a choice. And yes, Facebook is really nasty because Facebook knows that if it can show me a cops behaving badly video that but but it's just a matter of choice. That I've come to learn that my emotions are not something that someone puts on me. They're a choice that I make, because it's not my girlfriend's fault that I'm upset, regardless of whatever she did. It's my choice to be upset about whatever it was. It's not the rattlesnake that's making me upset. It's my choice. The snake is just being a snake. And so if I can keep that in mind, it's really helpful. Of course, there are some yoga techniques I use, like breathing, because yogis learned a long time ago that it's hard to control the mind, but what we can control is the breath. And if we can breathe calmly, the mind will tend to follow the breath. Or we can do the opposite direction. If you need to get excited, you know, the mind will tend to follow the breath as well. So, you know, there's that technique. And running really helps me to be settled and calm, because when I'm running, there is nothing else except me and the run. You know, there's no room for being upset about anything. And because running's just hard for me, because like I'm 60 years old.
You have advice for us on being more observant, actually capturing the changes in our gardens, in our farms. I remember the first time you came to my garden, I had 3 boysenberry bushes, and you go, oh, look, thornless. And I bought all 3 at the same time from the same place, but I didn't realize one was thornless. How can we, I mean, I'm learning to be more observant, but do you have words to stimulate us to be more observant? Because I think we can easily miss awesome things.
We'll see. Because of the darkness that I came out of, I had to learn to be super observant to protect myself. And so I don't know if I wish that skill on anybody else because of the darkness you have to go through to get to it. But we can just pay attention to what's happening around us, and that can be help us to be better seed savers, better gardeners. I did see a question pop through about how old I was when I left the church, and I was about 35, I think, in that ballpark.
That's it for the questions that we have. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.